People think this story ends with healing. You're wrong. It ends with silence, not the kind that soothes you, not the peaceful kind, like when the world is quiet after a long storm. No, this kind of silence burns. It lingers in your bones, sits heavy in your chest. It reminds you every minute of every day that you meant less to someone than they meant to you. I was supposed to get a call that morning. It was marked on my calendar in blue ink, a little star beside it. The phone will ring. That's what she promised. My granddaughter. She had something important to tell me, she said. It's a surprise, she laughed. But I promise you'll be the first to know. I set out the good teacups. I combed my hair twice. I wore the brooch she gave me last Christmas. And I waited. 10 came, then 10:30, 11. I told myself maybe she was running late. By noon, I had reheated my tea 3 times. By 3, I turned off the kettle. By 6, I knew she wasn't calling. But it wasn't just a missed call. My dears know that day, something inside me cracked, and I realized it had been cracking for years. This wasn't the first silence. It was just the one I couldn't ignore anymore. So before I begin, before I peel back the layers of this life I've lived, I'm asking you kindly, if you're still here, listening to an old woman who talks too much, please like this video, leave me a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe. Some stories must be told, even if they still hurt. Because this story, it doesn't begin with that call that never came. It begins long before with the first silence I ignored. That, let me take you back, let me take you back. Before the smartphones and video calls, before people could ghost you with a swipe of their thumb. Back when promises were spoken over porches, sealed with a pinky finger, or written in long, careful cursive on the back of postcards. That's the world I was raised in. A world where your word meant something. Where when you said you'd call, you called. I come from a town so small, if you blinked too long, you'd miss it. Just a speck on the back roads of Missouri, gravel streets, wooden porches, screen doors that slammed behind you like thunder. Our neighbors knew our business before we did, and yet, there was comfort in that closeness, in being seen. Even if it meant you couldn't hide much. My mama used to say, the only thing louder than a child's laughter is the silence that follows when they're grown. I didn't understand it then. I do now. That silence. It doesn't come all at once. No. It sneaks in slowly. At first, they stop coming over as often. Then they call less. Then birthdays are missed. Then Christmas cards stop. Until finally, you're just a name on an old family tree. A branch no one climbs anymore. That morning, the one I waited for, I told myself I was being silly. That she was probably just busy. But deep down, I knew. I'd felt it for months, maybe years. She was slipping away from me, and I was letting her. You know, child, when you're young, you think family is forever, that bonds made in blood can't break. But I've learned sometimes, it's not anger that ruins a family, it's apathy. It's forgetting to call, forgetting to ask, forgetting to care. I used to believe that if I just loved hard enough, loved purely and unconditionally, people would stay. But love, my sweethearts, love isn't always loud enough to drown out the world, so, no, this story doesn't end with healing. And I'm not here to make you feel better. I'm here to tell the truth. Even if it stings. Because maybe, just maybe, you'll hear something in my voice that reminds you of someone you forgot to call, and maybe you'll pick up that phone, not for me, but for the grandmother in your own life who's still waiting with her good teacups set out, still waiting, with her hair combed, her heart open. Still waiting for a call that may never come. Now, let's go back to the beginning, shall we? Back to when I was just a girl, barefoot in the dust, dreaming of a world far bigger than the one I was born into. I was born in the spring of 1948, in a town so small, they didn't even bother painting it on the state maps, just a bend in the gravel road in southern Missouri, where the breeze always smelled like fresh-cut hay and the rusted bells of the church rang out like clockwork every Sunday morning. Folks called it Garrison Hollow, though the joke was that only 3 families had ever lived there, and they were all related in some way. It wasn't much, but it was home. We lived in a weather-beaten 2-bedroom clapboard house with faded white paint and a tin roof that hummed in the rain. I used to fall asleep to that sound. My dears, the soft patter of spring rain tapping the metal above my head, like a lullaby only the country knew how to sing. The house sat on the edge of a cotton field, and in the evenings, when the wind shifted just right, You could hear the cicadas buzzing and the screen door creaking as my daddy came home, work-stained and smiling. My mama was a hard woman, not mean, but practical. She wore her hair in a tight bun and smelled of ivory soap and cornmeal. Her hands were always busy, kneading dough, patching clothes, snapping green beans into a tin bowl on the porch. She didn't have time for nonsense, as she liked to say. But every Saturday morning, without fail, she'd bake a batch of cinnamon rolls so sweet and sticky, you'd swear they were blessed. She never ate them herself, just made them for Daddy and me, humming old hymns under her breath while she worked. Daddy, now, he was different. He had a softness about him, a gentleness that didn't match his broad shoulders or calloused hands. He was the type to cry at gospel songs, to give away his last quarter if he thought you needed it more. He worked at the mill about 10 miles up the road, the kind of job that left splinters in his skin and dust in his lungs, but he never once complained. A man doesn't have to love his job, he'd say, wiping the sweat from his brow, just the people he's working for. We didn't have much money, but we had just enough. Mama canned everything, peaches, okra, tomatoes, lined up in jars like stained glass in the pantry. We wore hand-me-downs patched so many times they had personalities of their own. I had 2 dresses for school and 1 for church. That was it. But I never felt poor. Nobody did. We all had the same nothing, and that made it feel like something. Saturdays were my favorite. That was wash day, not because I liked doing laundry. Heavens no, but because Mama let me help hang the sheets on the clothesline, and I'd run between them like they were castle walls, the sun warming my back and the sheets snapping like sails. Afterwards, we'd listen to the radio together. Daddy loved the Grand Ole Opry. I loved when Patsy Cline came on, that voice of hers, mournful and mighty all at once. I'd sit cross-legged on the rug and pretend I was her, singing into a hairbrush like it was a microphone, swaying like the women I'd seen once in a magazine. School was a one-room house up the hill, with peeling paint and desks carved up by generations of bored children. Miss Janey taught us everything, reading, math, manners, and when we got good grades, she'd reward us with peppermint sticks from the glass jar on her desk. The boys smelled like cow manure, the girls braided each other's hair with weeds and ribbons, and every morning, we stood up and sang the pledge with our hands on our hearts like it meant something bigger than we could understand. The biggest event of the year was the church picnic. Lord, we waited all summer for it. Long tables under the oaks, checkered tablecloths weighed down with sweet tea, deviled eggs, fried chicken, peach cobbler, and pies as high as your hopes. The preacher's wife always brought her famous banana pudding, a recipe she swore came from heaven. We'd play horseshoes, tell ghost stories after dark, and the old folks would dance slow to the hum of a fiddle and someone's tired old guitar. That was normal for us. That was happiness. Simple, predictable, safe. But looking back, I can see things now I couldn't then. Like how Mama's hands would tremble sometimes when she thought no one was looking, or how Daddy would come home with that faraway look in his eyes after talking to Mr. Creighton, the mill supervisor, or the way my cousin Clara whispered about her mama crying in the barn when she thought the house was too quiet. But I didn't understand those things then. I was just a child. All I saw were the cinnamon rolls, the radio music, the Sunday hymns, and the safety of that warm kitchen. I didn't yet know the world could come undone. I believed, truly, that things would always stay just like they were. The sun would rise over that cotton field, Mama would keep the biscuits soft on the inside, and Daddy would always tuck me in smelling like pine tar and tobacco. I had no reason to believe otherwise, but life, my loves, it doesn't always give warnings. Sometimes, it just shifts, quietly, without asking, and the child, who once danced between clotheslines, becomes a woman sitting by the phone, waiting for a call that never comes. Sundays were sacred in our home, not just because of church, though Lord knows Mama insisted we'd be there even if the roof was leaking or our shoes didn't fit right. No, Sundays were special because they were the only time the world seemed to slow down. Daddy would shave that morning, always with the same dull razor and a cracked mirror he kept by the window, and Mama would starch her best dress and pin that little blue flower to her collar, the one Daddy picked for her back when they were courting. I'd sit on the back step with a bowl of cornflakes in my lap, watching the clouds roll over the cotton fields, pretending they were ships and I was the captain. I didn't have big dreams of cities or lights back then. I just wanted to grow up and be like Mama, to keep a tidy house, cook a good meal, and maybe have a girl of my own someday who'd run barefoot through the same backyard. Church was the beating heart of our little town. Everyone showed up, dressed in their best, even if best meant something borrowed and faded at the seams. Reverend Mason preached loud and long, his voice bouncing off those wooden rafters, and the choir, well, child, they could raise the dead with those harmonies. I'd sit between Mama and Daddy, legs swinging off the pew, staring at the stained glass windows like they held some secret I hadn't yet earned the right to know. After the service, the grown-ups would stand out front talking about crops and neighbors and God's will, while us kids chased each other through the gravestones out back, daring one another to touch the mossy ones, the oldest ones, the ones nobody visited anymore. Even then, I felt something quiet settle in my chest when I looked at those forgotten names. I didn't understand it at the time, but now I know. I was starting to feel the weight of memory, the weight of time. Back home, Mama would make a roast if we were lucky, or beans and cornbread if we weren't, and while it simmered, I'd lie belly down on the braided rug in the living room, drawing pictures on old envelopes and listening to Daddy's war stories. He didn't talk about it often, but every now and then, when the wind was right and his mood was soft, he'd pull out that tin box from under his bed. Inside was a folded flag, a silver lighter, and a photo of a boy I never met, his best friend from the service. "He saved my life," Dottie would say, thumbing the edges of the photograph like it might speak back if he held it gently enough. I never knew how to respond, so I'd just reach over and hold his hand. The first time I saw Mama cry, I was 9. It was late, and I'd come down for a drink of water. The house was quiet, dark. I found her standing by the sink, staring out into the night, her shoulders shaking. She didn't hear me at first. I just stood there, barefoot and confused, until she turned and smiled, that kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes. "Go on back to bed, sweetheart," she whispered. "Mama's just tired is all." That was the first time I realized grown-ups hurt too. It planted something in me, I think, a kind of caution. Like maybe love wasn't always enough, like maybe even the strongest people could break when nobody was watching. Still, those years were good ones. My childhood wasn't perfect, but it was whole in its own way. It was slow, safe, and small. A world where the biggest news was someone getting a new clothesline, or finding out Miss Janie was getting married to the barber who came through town once a month. Everyone knew everyone, and secrets had short legs. But you know the funny thing about small towns, secrets still exist, they just hide better. Like the time my uncle vanished for 3 days, and nobody ever spoke of it again. Or when Miss Ada suddenly stopped coming to church and her windows stayed dark for weeks. Or when the preacher's son left for college and never came home. Though his mother swore up and down he'd be back by Christmas. It's strange, the things we don't question when we're young, the silences we accept as normal. I suppose that's how it starts, this quiet unraveling of truth. Not with shouting or thunder, but with silence. Little pauses, little absences, one by one. Still, back then, I believed the world was steady. That good people were always good. That family stayed close. That Sunday dinners would last forever. And I believed, above all, that if you gave your heart to someone, whether friend, cousin, neighbor, or child, they'd hold it gently, carefully. The way Mama held her porcelain teacups when guests came over, that was the world I was raised in, child, and I clung to it like a hymn, even when it began to slip through my fingers. I think every child reaches an age when they start to see the cracks, not in the walls or the paint, but in the people. That happened to me the year I turned 11. Nothing big, nothing loud. Just little things that shifted. Like how my cousin Darlene stopped braiding my hair at recess and started whispering with the older girls instead, or how Daddy didn't whistle on his way in from work anymore. That summer, the air felt thicker, heavier, like it was holding its breath. And even though no one said a word, I could feel something changing. That was the year the mill started, cutting back first. It was extra shifts being cancelled. Then, hours were shortened. Then came the layoffs. Men who'd spent their whole lives sweating inside those factory balls were suddenly left with nothing but worn boots and quiet dinners. I remember the hush in church pews, the worry in the preacher's prayers, and the way the offering basket felt lighter than usual when it passed down the rows. Daddy kept his job for a while. He never said much about it, just came home a little slower each evening. Sometimes I'd see him sit out on the back step, a cup of coffee in one hand, the other resting on his knee like he was holding something invisible. I'd sit beside him, hoping he'd talk. He never did, but he'd put his arm around me, and that was enough. Or so I told myself. Mama, meanwhile, became even more practical than usual. She clipped coupons with a vengeance, traded extra jars of her preserves with neighbors, and took in mending work for folks in town. She never let on that things were tight, just made everything stretch further, like magic. But sometimes I'd hear her sigh when she thought no one was listening, a long, slow breath that sounded like it had traveled 1,000 miles just to escape her lungs. Still, life continued in that slow, rhythmic way country life always does. The seasons turned, the crops rose and fell, and the radio kept playing, songs that made you ache in your chest for reasons you didn't understand. I remember lying in bed at night, listening to Patsy Cline sing Crazy, and wondering what it meant to be heartsick. I hadn't known real sorrow yet, not fully, but something in that song made my eyes sting. Like it knew something I did. ID in single quotes. School became both a refuge and a mystery. I was a good student, always quick to finish my work, eager to please. But I also started noticing things like how Miss Janie's smile sometimes disappeared when no one was watching, or how the principal's wife never looked him in the eye during Sunday service. I was too young to name what I saw, but old enough to know it mattered. I had a best friend back then, a girl named Ruthie Mae. She had a laugh that could make the birds stop and listen, and freckles that danced across her nose like sugar sprinkles. We used to walk barefoot to the creek after school, carrying jars to catch tadpoles, and telling each other secrets we thought would bind us for life. Ruthie said she was going to be a nurse someday. I told her I'd be a teacher, or maybe a singer. If God gave me the nerve. We made a pact under the willow tree by the bend, that no matter what happened, we'd never forget each other. But life, my dear, it doesn't honor childhood promises. Not always. By the time I was 13, Ruthie's family moved up north. Her daddy got work in a tire plant outside St. Louis, and just like that, she was gone. One day we were sharing secrets and peach slices on the creek bank, and the next I was standing alone, looking at the water and wondering if I'd ever laugh like that again. That was the first time I felt true absence. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, like an echo that never came back. Mama told me that's just how life worked. People come and go, she said, stirring a pot of beans. You'll learn to live with it. But I didn't want to learn. I wanted things to stay still, to stay whole. I didn't know, then, that this was the training ground for everything else. That small heartbreaks prepare you for bigger ones, that the soft ache of losing a friend would one day feel like a warm memory compared to what was coming. But in that moment, I was just a girl with freckles on her nose and dirt under her fingernails, staring at a creek and wondering why the world didn't hold still when your heart asked it to. Still, I kept going. We all did. There was no other choice. Life didn't stop for sorrow, not in Garrison Hollow. The crops still needed tending. The porch needed painting. The choir needed another soprano. And so I sang. I helped Mama peel potatoes. I listened to Daddy's boots on the stairs and told myself everything was just the way it used to be, even when it wasn't. The last truly peaceful summer I can remember was the one when I turned 14. It was 1962. The kind of summer where the heat curled the curtains and the lemonade tasted like melted gold. The radio played Johnny Angel and the Twist, and even Mama tapped her foot sometimes while she shelled peas. That year, I felt something start to bloom inside me, something unspoken. I'd catch myself watching the older girls in town, the way they wore their hair teased high, their lips painted coral pink. I was just a skinny thing, all elbows and daydreams, but something was stirring. I felt it in the way I walked, in the sudden embarrassment I felt when the older boys passed by. My body was changing, yes, but more than that, my sense of safety was changing to. One afternoon, I overheard Daddy and Mama talking in hushed voices behind the pantry door. I'd gone looking for a jar of blackberry jam and caught them mid-whisper. Her, Daddy said, his voice thick. She's old enough. No, Mama snapped. Not yet, Margaret, he began, but her silence cut sharper than any shout. I never did find out what they were talking about, but from that day on, I started watching them with new eyes. Mama seemed more tired lately. She didn't hum while she cooked. Her hands moved slower. Some days, she'd stare out the window for so long I wondered if she saw ghosts in the yard. And Daddy, well, he stopped sitting on the back step, stopped telling his stories. He still smiled, oh yes, always smiled, but but it looked like the kind of smile you put on when your shoes are too tight and you don't want to complain. Then came the letter. It was late August when it arrived. Thick cream envelope, no return address, but Mama knew. I could tell by the way her fingers trembled when she opened it. She didn't read it right away, just stared at the folded paper like it might bite her. When she finally did read it, she sat down so fast the chair scraped across the floor. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she just folded it slowly and tucked it into her apron pocket. When I asked what it was, she said only this: family business. Not yours to worry about, but I did worry. Because after that day, everything felt different. Mama started locking her bedroom door at night. Daddy started sleeping in his old recliner. And I started wondering if the people I loved had secrets too heavy to tell. School started again that September. But I didn't feel like a girl anymore. Not really. I carried invisible questions in my satchel. I studied my parents like strangers. And then, as if the Lord himself was testing our strength, it happened. Mama collapsed in the kitchen. It was a Sunday morning. The biscuits were still in the oven, the smell of bacon in the air, and just like that, she fell. No warning, no sound. One moment she was reaching for the flour tin, the next, she was on the floor. Her lips blue and her eyes fluttering like moth wings. Daddy screamed her name. I froze. The doctor came in from town, his car kicking up dust like a storm behind it. They laid her on the couch, fanning her with dish towels, feeding her teaspoons of water like she was a baby bird. She came to after what felt like forever. Her voice was weak, but her first words were, "Don't let the biscuits burn." Typical Mama. But it wasn't just a fainting spell. Not this time. The doctor pulled Daddy aside. I stood close enough to hear. "Her heart," he said. "It's weak. And frankly, I'm surprised this didn't happen sooner." Daddy asked about medicine, about treatment, about hope. The doctor just sighed. "She needs rest, less stress, and a good deal of peace." Peace. In a house suddenly filled with silence and half-truths. That's when the cracks really began to show. Mama no longer cooked much after that. I took over at first clumsily, then with quiet confidence. I burned more meals than I cared to admit, but Daddy never said a word. He'd just pat my shoulder, eat what I made, and say, "You did your best, sweetheart." That winter was long, cold and brittle, like broken glass. Mama slept more. Daddy prayed more, and I began to drift inside myself, unsure where girlhood ended and womanhood began. There's something strange about watching your parents become smaller, not in height, no, but in spirit, in weight. As if the burdens of the world start pressing them down inch by inch, and you, a child who once looked up at them like giants, begin to see them for what they really are, just people, fragile, tired people, doing their best with what little life gave them. That winter, I learned how to iron Daddy's shirts, how to make biscuits from scratch, and how to tell when Mama's coughing meant she needed help and when it meant she needed to be alone. I stopped going to Ruthie's old creek. I stopped drawing in the margins of my school books. The girl I had been, lighthearted, daydreamy, was fading. I was learning the quiet work of holding things together. One morning, in February, I found Daddy staring at the kitchen table, a letter opened in front of him. His coffee had gone cold. His hands were folded too neatly, like he was bracing for something. "It's from the mill," he said, not looking up. "They're letting more men go, me included." I didn't know what to say. What could I say? We had no savings. Mama was too sick to work. And now Daddy, the man who'd held that job longer than I'd been alive, had been replaced by someone younger, cheaper, faster. He stood up slowly, like the weight of that letter had aged him. "Don't tell your mama just yet," he said softly. "She doesn't need that kind of worry." But of course, Mama already knew. She always knew. That night, she said nothing, but I saw her tear one of the sheets in half and start stitching it into rags. "Just old linen," she murmured. "No sense in keeping what can't be used." That's what we did in those days. We turned things into other things. Old dresses became aprons, glass jars became drinking cups, hope became habit. Daddy tried to find work. He walked into town every morning, hat in hand, asking after any odd job, painting, hauling, fixing fences. Some days he found work, most days he didn't. Still, he came home with his boots muddy and his back aching, like a man too proud to let the world see how broken he felt. And then came the man in the gray coat. I remember it like a scene from a play. It was early March. The snow was melting, and muddy footprints tracked across the floor Mama had just mopped. A knock at the door. 3 short taps. Daddy opened it. A man stood there, not tall, but sharp-looking, like he came from somewhere that smelled of cigars and paper. He wore a city coat and carried a clipboard. "I'm here about the note," he said. The note. That was the first time I'd heard about it. Turned out, Daddy had taken a small loan to cover Mama's medicine. Just a bit to get us through winter. But now, the man in the gray coat was here to say, a bit had become a burden. Payments were due, interest had grown teeth, and if we couldn't pay soon, they'd be taking the truck. Maybe the house. Daddy nodded quietly, his face unreadable. "We'll pay," he said. "Just give us time." But the man didn't come to offer time. He came to collect it. That night, Mama and Daddy argued. Not the loud kind, the worse kind, the whispered kind, the behind closed doors kind. I pressed my ear against the wall and caught only fragments. "You should have told me. I didn't want to worry you. This was supposed to help us, not sink us. I'm doing the best I can, Margaret." And then, silence. I waited for a door to slam. None did, just footsteps retreating to separate rooms. To people who used to dance in the kitchen now, sleeping with their backs to each other. I didn't sleep much after that. Something had shifted in the house. It wasn't just the money. It wasn't just Mama's health or Daddy's job. It was the weight of everything, all at once. The walls had absorbed our fear, and were now breathing it back at us in the dark. The next Sunday, I went to church alone. Mama said she wasn't feeling up to it. Daddy said he had chores. So I put on my best dress, the one I'd outgrown a little, and walked the dusty road by myself. The congregation smiled politely, but I could feel it. The whispers, the deviated glances, everyone knew something was wrong. That's the thing about small towns. They know, even when you say nothing, they know. I sat through Reverend Mason's sermon, though I couldn't tell you a word he said. My thoughts kept drifting to the man in the gray coat, to Mama's pale face, to the stack of unpaid bills I'd seen tucked behind the bread tin. And I thought, so this is what it means to grow up. Not birthday candles, or training brass, or stolen kisses behind the barn. No. Growing up is realizing your parents are scared, that sometimes, no one has a plan, that love doesn't pay bills, and courage doesn't cure illness. I walked home slow that day. The sky was the color of dishwater, and somewhere deep inside me, I felt it, that first small voice, the one that whispered, "Things will never be the same again." I didn't tell anyone about the way my hands started shaking sometimes when I washed the dishes, or how I'd lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, counting cracks like they were stars. I was too proud, too ashamed, too young to have words for the heavy things I was beginning to feel. That spring, Daddy found steady work on a farm just past the county line. It wasn't much clearing brush, mending fences, tending livestock, but it kept him busy. And it brought home enough money to keep the lights on. He left before sunrise and came home long after dark. His hands were always scraped and blistered, his shirts soaked with sweat, his face thin and quiet. He didn't talk much anymore, neither did Mama. Mama's health improved a little once the worst of winter passed. She still tired easily, still had those long coughing spells, but she started sitting out on the porch again. She'd wrap a shawl around her shoulders and sip tea from the blue cup I'd chipped as a child. She liked to watch the birds. She said their comings and goings reminded her that some things still made sense. I started keeping a journal, just a little one, brown leather, a gift from my aunt on my 15th birthday. I wrote down everything, what Mama cooked, what Daddy said, what I heard whispered in town, and what I didn't understand but needed to remember. Writing gave me a place to put my questions, even if I didn't have answers. I still went to school, though it felt different now. I was no longer part of the giggling crowd. I kept to myself, finished my work quickly, and went straight home to help Mama. My teachers praised me for my focus. They didn't see the worry behind it. They didn't see the girl who skipped lunch to save money or who flinched every time someone mentioned doctors or debt. One afternoon, I stayed behind to help Miss Evelyn clean the blackboards. She was our literature teacher, sharp but kind, with silver-rimmed glasses and a voice like warm honey. "You're quiet lately," she said as she wiped the chalk from her fingers. "You used to ask 100 questions." I shrugged. She looked at me closely, the way women do when they know more than they're letting on. "There's strength in silence," she said gently. "But don't forget, child, silence can also be a cage." I nodded, but I didn't say a word. Not then. Later that week, I wrote those words down in my journal. I underlined them twice. That spring was also when I learned how much people in town liked to talk. When Mama and I would go to the grocer, we'd feel the stares before we even reached the shelves. Some folks were kind, offering coupons, or slipping an extra can into our basket. Others whispered behind their hands or clucked their tongues, like pity was something they enjoyed tasting. It was hard not to hate them. Harder still to admit that I sometimes believed what they whispered. She's not getting better. They're barely hanging on. I heard they might lose the house. I began walking home a longer way, just to avoid certain shops. I stopped going to the creek entirely. The willow tree where Ruthie and I had once made our promises looked too much like a grave marker now. And then came the phone call. It was late May. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long golden shadows through the kitchen window. Mama was dicing onions. I was setting the table. The phone rang, sharp and sudden. We both jumped. Mama picked it up, expecting my aunt or a neighbor. I watched her face change. Yes, she said. This is Margaret Whitlow. She paused. I see. No, I wasn't aware. When another pause, her knuckles turned white against the counter. Yes, thank you for calling. She hung up the phone. Her hands dropped to her sides. I asked what happened. She didn't answer. Mama. She walked to the sink, turned on the water, and stood there, just stood there, watching it run. It was your father's brother, she said finally. Uncle Vernon. He passed last night. Heart attack. I didn't know what to say. We hadn't seen Uncle Vernon in years. Daddy barely spoke of him, but something in Mama's voice made me uneasy. What is it? I asked. She turned to me slowly. Your father's going to the funeral. Alone. That night I overheard them again. This time, not arguing, just distant. I don't want you going, Mama said. He was my brother. Daddy replied. I know what he was. That was all I caught. Daddy left the next morning, wearing his nicest shirt and the boots he only wore to weddings or funerals. He kissed Mama's forehead, then looked at me. Take care of her while I'm gone, he said. I nodded. He didn't return for 3 days. When he did, something in him was different, not broken, not angry, just quieter, like something had been sealed up. He didn't speak much about the funeral, just said Vernon looked peaceful, said there were only a handful of people there. I believed him, but I also noticed the envelope in his coat pocket, noticed how he started sitting on the porch alone at night again, and I noticed the way Mama avoided looking at him for a week straight. Something had happened, and I wasn't sure. I wanted to know what. The day everything changed didn't look like a tragedy. It was just an ordinary Tuesday in June. The sun was shining, birds were chirping. Mama was sitting in her chair by the window, knitting the hem of an old pillowcase, and I was sweeping the kitchen floor. We had leftover stew bubbling on the stove, and I remember thinking how peaceful the house felt, almost like we'd made it through something, like maybe, just maybe, we were turning a corner. Daddy had been quieter since the funeral, but he was still showing up, still going to work at Mr. Rayner's farm, still bringing home sacks of potatoes and jars of honey as payment when cash was tight. He wasn't laughing like he used to, and he didn't play checkers with me on Sundays anymore, but he was present, and after everything, I'd learned that presence mattered more than smiles. So when he came through the door that evening with his hat in one hand and an envelope in the other, I didn't expect anything to be wrong. He handed it to Mama without a word. She looked at it for a long moment, then opened it slowly. There were only 2 sheets of paper inside, typed, folded neatly. Her eyes scanned them once, then twice. She looked up at Daddy. Is this real? She asked. He nodded. Mama sat down, and something inside me knew, before she even said a word, that we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. She handed me the papers. I read the top line aloud, even though my throat had gone dry. Notice of property seizure. I didn't understand all the language, not then, but I knew enough. We were losing the house. He hadn't told us. He'd stopped making payments months ago, trying to juggle too many debts. He had borrowed against the property, thinking he could pay it off once work picked up again. But work never really picked up, and now it was too late. We had 30 days to leave. Mama didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She just stood up and walked to the kitchen sink, then back to her chair. She sat down and picked up her needle and thread like nothing had happened. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the papers and shout and ask my father how he could do this, how he could hide this from us, how he could sit at the table every night and look us in the eye and pretend everything was fine, but I didn't. I just stood there still, numb. That night, I heard them fight. This time, it wasn't quiet. Mama's voice was sharp and shaking. You promised me this house, she shouted. You said it would be ours forever. I was trying to fix it, he shouted back. You think I wanted this? You think I don't lie awake every night wishing I could give you more? You lied to us, Raymond. You lied. I covered my ears with my pillow, but it didn't matter. The truth had already settled in my chest like a stone. The next morning, Daddy was gone. Not forever, not yet. Just gone for the day, without a word of where he'd gone or when he'd be back. Mama didn't ask. She just drank her tea and looked out the window like she was watching the sky for answers. We spent that week in a strange kind of silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that fills the room like thick smoke. Mama started packing quietly. I helped her wrap dishes in old towels. I stacked books and folded linens and labeled boxes in pencil. We didn't talk about where we'd go. We didn't have family nearby, and no one in town was likely to take in a sick woman and her 16-year-old daughter. But we kept packing, because there was no other choice. The day we moved out of that house was the first time I saw my mother cry. Not soft tears, not a gentle weep. Real crying. The kind that shakes a person, the kind you can't stop once it starts. We had packed nearly everything into the back of an old pickup truck Daddy had borrowed from someone in town. It sputtered and wheezed every time he turned the key, like even the truck didn't want to carry the weight of our failure. I watched Mama walk through each room one last time, her hand brushing the walls like she was saying goodbye to old friends. She didn't speak, but I saw the way her shoulders trembled when she stood in what used to be her sewing corner. She had made my Easter dresses there, hemmed her wedding skirt there, prayed quietly some nights when she thought I was asleep. She stood in the doorway of my room, eyes fixed on the sun-faded spot where my little desk used to sit. Then she turned away, went outside, and sat on the edge of the porch. The boards creaked beneath her, dry and splintered with age. I followed her, unsure what to do. That's when she started crying. She didn't make a sound. No heaving sobs or choking gasps. Just tears, endless tears running down her cheeks like someone had turned on a faucet inside her and broken the handle. I sat next to her. I didn't say anything. There was nothing I could say. Daddy stayed by the truck, fiddling with the rope that held our boxers in place, pretending not to see. Or maybe he really didn't. Maybe his guilt made him blind. We left that house on a Thursday morning. The sky was heavy, like it might rain but hadn't made up its mind. We drove for nearly an hour before pulling into the gravel driveway of a two-room cottage on the outskirts of town that it belonged to a man Daddy had once worked with. He said we could stay for a while, just until we got on our feet again. It wasn't home. It smelled like dust and mothballs. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners. The stove clicked 3 times before it lit. The back door didn't close all the way, unless you lifted it just right. But we didn't complain, we just unpacked. Mama took the smaller room. She said she liked the window facing east. I knew the real reason she didn't want to share a bed with Daddy anymore. I didn't blame her. I slept on a narrow mattress with lumpy springs, next to a wall that had a long crack running through it like a scar. I stared at that crack most nights, tracing it with my eyes like it might reveal something if I looked hard enough. It didn't. Single quotes. School ended the following week. I didn't go to the ceremony. I told everyone I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't a lie. I felt like I was disappearing, like every part of the girl I used to be had been packed in a box and left behind. Mama's cough came back stronger. She spent more and more time in bed, her tea cooling untouched on the nightstand. I'd sit beside her and read old magazine articles aloud, even though I knew she wasn't really listening. Daddy spent long hours away again. He said he was looking for better work, but I never knew where he actually went. He'd come home after dark, smelling like smoke and oil and something else I couldn't name. He looked older now, tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. One night, I asked him, "Do you still love her?" He blinked, looked at me like I'd asked a question in another language. "She's my wife," he said finally. "That's not what I asked." He didn't answer. I didn't ask again. Mama kept getting worse, and then one night, she didn't wake up for dinner. I brought her soup like always, knocked on her door. No answer. I opened it slowly, the tray shaking in my hands. She was curled on her side, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Too shallow. I ran to Daddy. He drove her to the hospital without speaking a word. I sat in the back seat, holding Mama's hand the whole way, whispering prayers I didn't know I still remembered. The doctor came out with a clipboard and a calm face. Too calm. She's stable, he said, but she need to stay for observation. She's severely dehydrated and showing signs of pneumonia. Daddy nodded, thanked him, and sat down heavily on the nearest bench. I stood. I did not sit. I watched the hallway. Mama had been taken down. My hands clenched into fists, so tight I left little crescent marks in my palms. We stayed there for 4 days. Each day Daddy would come and go. I never asked where he went. He never offered to tell. I sat beside Mama's bed, reading from the Bible or holding her hand while the machines beeped and the nurses whispered in the hall. And on the 5th day, Daddy didn't come back. I waited until noon. Then 3 o'clock. Then evening fell, and I realized he wasn't coming. Not that day, maybe not ever. That night, I stayed in the chair beside Mama's hospital bed, wrapped in my father's old jacket, because the nurse said I couldn't stay without a guardian, and I told her my father was just downstairs. I lied because I didn't know what else to do, and I wasn't going to leave her alone. She woke once, just long enough to whisper my name. I squeezed her hand. I'm here, Mama. I'm not going anywhere. She gave the smallest nod. Then, she drifted off again, lost in the rhythm of shallow breaths and blinking monitors. By morning, I knew he wasn't coming back. The nurse came in with her clipboard and a forced smile. Has your father been by yet, sweetheart? I shook my head. She pursed her lips. Well, I'll check with admissions. Maybe he called, but he hadn't. Not that day. Not the next. I walked to the payphone in the hallway, quarters trembling in my hand, and dialed every number I knew. Neighbors, friends of his, even the man who'd loaned us the truck. No one had seen him. Or, if they had, they weren't telling me the truth. And just like that, at 16 years old, I became the next of kin. The hospital assigned a social worker. Her name was Miss Lane. She wore a red scarf and had kind eyes, but I hated her the minute she said the word placement. I know this is a lot, she said gently, but if your mother doesn't recover fully, we'll need to consider a temporary arrangement. I stared at her. You mean a foster home? Just something safe. Until we know more. Safe. Nothing felt safe. Mama was sleeping 2 feet away, her chest rising and falling under a paper-thin blanket. And here, this stranger was, already making plans to move me somewhere I didn't belong. I said nothing. I just nodded like I understood, then turned my chair back, toward the window. The day Mama was discharged, she could barely walk. They wheeled her to the parking lot in a chair, her body too light under the hospital blanket, her cheeks sunken and pale, and still, he wasn't there. I used the last few dollars in my coat pocket to pay for a taxi. The driver didn't ask questions. He just helped me get her in, loaded the old blanket and paper bag of medicine, and drove us back to that creaking cottage on the edge of town. When we got there, I helped her into bed and tucked the covers around her like I was the mother now. She was quiet, hollow, her voice barely a whisper. Where is he? She asked once. I wanted to lie. I wanted to say he'd been delayed or sick or stuck on a job, but I looked into her eyes, and I told her the truth. I don't know. She nodded slowly. I think he's gone, baby. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, holding her hand, pretending not to notice the tear that slipped down her cheek. That was the beginning of the loneliest season of my life. It was summer, but it didn't feel like summer. The air was thick and hot, the days too long, the nights too quiet. I took a job cleaning at the school, mopping hallways and scrubbing chalkboards for a few dollars under the table. I brought groceries home in brown paper bags and learned how to stretch a can of beans into 3 meals. The neighbors stopped coming by. Maybe they didn't know what to say. Maybe they didn't care. Small towns have long memories, but they also have short attention spans. Once the gossip dries up, people move on. We were forgotten. I washed Mama's hair once a week in a metal basin. I folded her laundry. I sat with her in the evenings and read the newspaper aloud, even though she rarely reacted. She was drifting, slipping into herself, and I didn't know how to bring her back. One night in late July, I found a note on the doorstep. No envelope, no signature, just a folded piece of paper weighed down with a rock. I unfolded it with shaking hands. It said, he was seen on Route 51 last week, headed south. That was all. No name, no apology, no explanation, just proof that the man I called my father had walked away from us without a second thought. I burned the note in the kitchen sink. I didn't tell Mama. What good would it do? He was gone, and we were still here. I don't remember choosing to survive. It wasn't a decision. Not really. There wasn't a moment where I stood up and declared, I'd keep going. I just did because there wasn't another choice. Because no one else was going to do it for us. So I woke up before the sun, boiled water for Mama's tea, washed the bed sheets, and cleaned the kitchen before heading down to the school where I scrubbed floors while the teachers were on break. The janitor, Mr. Harris, gave me a mop and a set of keys, said I was a hard worker. I think he meant it as a compliment, but I couldn't help but feel like he was talking about someone else, someone older, stronger. But I was getting older, fast, and strength doesn't always come from age. Sometimes it comes from need. Mama wasn't the same after the hospital. Her body was there, but her spirit, it had folded in on itself. She spoke less, slept more. She still tried to sew now and then, but her hands would tremble too much, and she'd put the needle down with a sigh. I'd find her sitting in her rocking chair, staring out the window with that faraway look, like she was waiting on someone who wasn't coming back. I didn't ask who. I think we both knew. She never spoke his name again. Neither did I. Instead, I created a rhythm. Morning chores, work soup on the stove by 4, Mama's medicine by 5, laundry in the sink by 6, reading the newspaper out loud at 7, prayers by 8. It wasn't much of a life, but it was a life. One stitch at a time, I held it together. Some nights I cried in the bathtub, when Mama couldn't hear me. Not big sobs, just quiet tears that rolled down my face and disappeared into the water. I'd press my hand against my mouth to keep the sound in. I was afraid that if I let it out, it wouldn't stop, that it would turn into something too big, too wild. So I cried like I did everything else, small, controlled, private. We had no car, so I walked everywhere, to the school, to the store, to the post office. I'd cut across empty fields and behind neighbors' sheds to avoid stares and whispered, pity. At the store, I memorized prices before I went in. I knew exactly how much sugar, rice, and oil I could buy with whatever coins I had tucked in my pocket. Sometimes I'd linger near the bakery aisle, just long enough to smell the cinnamon rolls. Then, I'd walk away. Once, the grocer's wife slipped a small bag of peaches into my tote when she thought I wasn't looking. I saw, but I didn't say a word. That night, I cut them up into slices and placed them in a chipped ceramic bowl for Mama. She hadn't eaten much that week, but she smiled when she tasted them. Sunshine, she whispered. I nodded. Just a little, I said. We didn't speak of the kindness, or the shame, or the way hunger makes you grateful and humiliated at the same time. There were days when I hated everything. The house, the town, the smell of rust in the water, the way people looked at us with either too much concern or none at all. But then, I'd look at Mama, her breath soft and shallow, her face thinner than I remembered. And I'd remember why I kept going. She needed me, and whether I liked it or not, I had become her world. The days blurred together in those years, one after another, like beads on a worn-out string. I kept my head down. I did what needed doing, and somewhere in the thick of it, I began to notice something I hadn't expected. I was getting stronger, not the kind of strong you read about in books. I didn't slay dragons or make speeches or rise up with fire in my voice. No, it was quieter than that, smaller, more ordinary, but real. I learned how to stretch a dollar until it squeaked. I learned which kinds of canned goods kept best through winter, which herbs helped Mama's cough when the medicine ran out, and how to darn socks so well you couldn't even see the holes anymore. I also learned how to fix the leaky faucet in the kitchen, how to relight the stove when the pilot went out, how to repair the hinge on the front door so it didn't swing in the wind and keep us up at night. By 17, I could do almost everything Daddy used to do, except disappear. I stayed, and every single day I stayed made me stronger than I had been the day before. One Sunday afternoon, I was scrubbing the school's front steps when a woman in a red car pulled into the lot. She stepped out wearing sunglasses and a pressed gray skirt, the kind you'd only see in department store catalogs. She introduced herself as Mrs. Clara Denton, said she worked at the county office downtown. I hear you're dependable, she said. I stood there in my work apron, my hands soaked to the wrists in soapy water, not sure how to respond. She smiled and handed me a folded flyer. There's a clerical assistant position open, she said, part-time, but it pays better than cleaning floors. We need someone who shows up on time and doesn't complain. I told her I didn't know how to type. Well, she said, then it's time to learn. That night, after Mama had gone to sleep, I sat in the kitchen with a borrowed typewriter from the school library and an old instruction book. The keys were stiff, the ribbon was faded. I had to hit each letter like I was driving a nail into wood, but I learned that my W's leaned too far left and my S's always came out faint. But I typed every word of that instruction book by the end of the week. Twice, I got the job. It was just a desk in a dusty corner of the records office, filing birth certificates, logging applications, typing receipts, but it was quiet, and it was clean. And most importantly, it meant I didn't have to scrub other people's messes for the rest of my life. I started bringing home a little more money, enough to buy fresh vegetables instead of just cans, enough for a second pair of shoes, enough to buy Mama a proper nightgown instead of the threadbare flannel one she'd worn all year. She noticed. You're changing, she said one morning as I poured her tea. I looked at her. She smiled, small and soft, not in a bad way, just growing. I didn't feel grown. I still felt like that girl in the rocking chair, watching her mother cry on the porch. But I suppose growth sneaks up on you. It's not a sunrise. It's a slow shift in the light. So gradual, you don't see it until you look back and realize the whole world has changed color. There were still hard days, plenty of them. Days when Mama was too weak to eat. Days when my paycheck didn't stretch far enough. Days when the loneliness pressed so hard against my ribs, I had to bite my lip to keep from sobbing in public. But I didn't give up, because I couldn't. And deep down, I knew, if I could make it through that season, I could make it through anything. Mama's strength never fully returned. Some days were better than others. She'd wake up humming an old hymn or ask me to help her brush her hair just right. On those days, we'd sit together at the little table, sipping weak tea and talking about nothing and everything. She'd ask about work, about town gossip, about whether the peonies had started blooming along the neighbor's fence. But most days, she stayed in bed. Her cough had grown deeper, wetter. She'd wince when she breathed too hard, and I started to recognize the look in her eyes, the one that said she knew time was slipping through her fingers. One evening, I brought her some fresh cornbread wrapped in a cloth. She smiled, took a bite, then set it aside, and looked at me with that same tired softness she always wore now. You've done more than anyone had a right to ask, she said. I sat beside her. You're my Mama. There's nothing to repay. She reached out and took my hand, thin and cold. I worry about what happens when I'm gone. Don't, I said. Just rest. We'll deal with things when we get there. But we both knew we were already there. The last week came quietly. No dramatic moments. No rushing ambulances, no gasping final words like in the movies, just silence. She slept more, ate less. Her fingers curled softly on the edge of the blanket like she was holding on to something only she could see. I stayed by her side. Even when she didn't know I was there, I read from her Bible, sang the lullabies she once sang to me, and laid my head on the edge of the bed when I was too tired to sit upright, on a Wednesday morning. As the sun poured in through the curtains, just so that soft golden way it only does in early fall, I felt her squeeze my hand one last time. Then, she let go. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there, staring at her face, memorizing every wrinkle, every line, the gentle curve of her lips. It was like watching a candle go out, no wind, no sound, just gone. I buried her in a quiet corner of the town cemetery, beside a sycamore tree that turned bright red every October. There was no big funeral, just me, the preacher, and 2 women from the church who brought a casserole afterward like grief could be eaten in spoonfuls. I wore the same blue dress she once mended for me, and I tucked one of her hair ribbons into the breast pocket of my coat. When the preacher asked if I wanted to say anything, I said only this: she loved without asking for anything in return, and I'll carry that love for the rest of my life. Then I walked home. Alone. The house was too quiet without her. At first, I left everything as it was. Her slippers beside the bed, her teacup on the counter, her brush still full of soft gray strands. It took me weeks to move them, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to believe she was really gone. But time does what it always does. It moves forward. Whether we're ready or not, the bills still came. The days still passed, and I still had to get up each morning and go to work. Even if my heart hadn't caught up to my body, grief became my shadow, always present, not loud, just there. I talked to her sometimes, while doing dishes or walking to work. Mama, you'd have liked the way the light hit the windows this morning. Mama, I wore your scarf today, still smells like lavender. Mama, I miss you so much. It didn't fill the hole, but it reminded me that love doesn't leave just because people do. She was in everything I did, the way I folded towels, the way I steeped tea, the way I paused before answering, just like she used to. And I kept going, because she taught me how. Winter came early that year. The wind had a bite in it by mid-October, and the first snow came before Halloween. I patched the roof with tar and spare shingles I found behind the old church. I sealed the windows with plastic and old quilts. I learned the language of cold, how it crept through the floorboards and settled in your bones when the fire died down too soon. But I didn't complain. Mama had always said, a house can be poor, but it doesn't have to be bitter. So I kept the radio playing when I came home from work. I lit candles when the power flickered. I made soup from broth and potatoes and tried to make the place smell like comfort, even if it didn't feel like it. And I read everything. I could get my hands on old library books, newspapers, flyers. I read aloud to the silence, because sometimes the sound of my own voice reminded me I was still here, still trying, still alive. I even applied for night classes at the vocational college across town. I told them I didn't have a diploma, but I'd been working with records and paperwork for over a year. I didn't know then that my hands, once cracked from bleach water and floor wax, would one day type up invoices, legal letters, even resumes for others. The woman at the desk, Miss Tolly, looked over my application and said, "We'll give you a try." That little sentence stayed with me for years. "We'll give you a try," like I was worth betting on. And for the first time in a long while, I started to believe I was. I'd come home late, sometimes after dark, and eat a piece of toast or heat up whatever soup I'd made that week. Then, I'd sit down at the table, spread my papers out, and study until my eyes burned. It was lonely work, but it was mine. I missed Mama every single day, but there was something strange about grief. It didn't get smaller, but it gave me space. Space to grow inside it. Space to remember her without breaking every time I started keeping her Bible open on the table again, not as a symbol of sorrow, but as a promise. A reminder of the woman who had loved me, who had raised me to stand even when the ground shook. I found old photos in a box tucked away in the hall closet. Mama, in her wedding dress, her eyes soft and full of hope. Me as a baby on her lap, gripping her finger like it was the whole world. I framed one and placed it by the front door. Every morning, I touched the frame before heading to work. "Wish me luck, Mama," I'd whisper. And every evening, when I came back, tired, sore, but still standing, I'd smile at her picture, like she already knew. One Friday evening in December, I received my first official paycheck from the college. It wasn't much, but it had my name printed clean across the top, not as a cleaner, not as a clerk, but as an assistant to the records supervisor. I held that check in both hands like it was made of glass. It was proof. Proof that I hadn't just survived, I had moved forward. That night, I took a long walk through town, past the diner, past the old school, past the cemetery gates where Mama rested beneath the sycamore tree. I stood there a moment, the snow crunching under my boots, the world so still I could hear my own breath, and I spoke into the cold air like it could carry my voice wherever it needed to go. I did it, Mama. I made it. The wind blew softly through the branches above me, and the bare limbs of the tree creaked like they were nodding. I smiled. For the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled without guilt. That was the night I knew something had changed. Would never be the girl I was before. I had buried too much. I had lost too much, but I had also built something no one could ever take from me. Not a man, not poverty, not time. I had built a life. And even if it was small, even if no one else noticed, it was mine. Not years had softened the sharp edges of my memories. By then, I was in my late 30s, maybe early 40s. It's funny how time bends. After a while, you stop counting candles on cakes or anniversaries of sorrow. You just live, quietly, steadily. I had built a life. Nothing grand, nothing glamorous, but it was honest. I worked weekdays at the records office, kept a tidy house, and spent weekends tending to my small garden out back. I even baked for the church potluck sometimes, though I rarely stayed to chat. People saw me as reliable. That word followed me like a name tag. reliable Miss Carter. First to arrive, last to complain, but even a life stitched neatly together has seams, and mine began to pull the morning. I found the letter in my mailbox, that it was thicker than most. Pale blue envelope, my full name typed across the front, not handwritten, no return address, no familiar handwriting. I stood in the kitchen, the envelope trembling slightly in my hand. I hadn't felt that kind of nervous in years. Inside was a formal document from the Oklahoma Department of Corrections. I read the first line 3 times before I understood what it said. Raymond Elijah Carter, my father, had died 3 months earlier. He hadn't died in a car crash like we believed. He hadn't vanished without a trace or started over in some distant town. He had been in prison. All that time, under an alias, in a facility not 50 miles from where we had once lived, convicted on charges unrelated to us, fraud, assault, false identification. And now he was gone, officially, permanently. The letter stated that I had been listed as next of kin. There was no estate, no body to claim, but there was one item in storage they wanted to offer me, a journal. That single word knocked the air from my lungs. For days I left the envelope on my desk, unopened again but never out of sight. I went to work. I cooked my meals. I greeted the clerk at the grocery store like nothing had changed, but I could feel it, this shift, pressing into the quiet parts of me. When the journal arrived, I didn't open it right away. I placed it on the table next to Mama's Bible. I stared at the cover, black leather, worn at the corners, no initials, no title. That evening, with the porch light flickering above me, I turned to the first page. His handwriting was still the same, sharp, slanted, impatient. I didn't mean to disappear, it read, but once I started lying, I didn't know how to stop. There were entries going back to the early 1980s, some short, just a sentence, others long and winding. He wrote about the night he left, about stealing a car and driving until the road curved sharp and fast through unfamiliar counties. He wrote about getting caught in Arkansas for a separate crime, how he gave them a fake name and stuck with it, how he told himself it was better this way. He never sent a letter to Mama, never called. He wrote about her, though, about the way she used to hum while folding laundry, or how her cornbread always tasted like Sunday afternoons. He said he knew she'd never forgive him, and that was part of why he stayed silent. He wrote about me. He remembered things I thought he had forgotten. My favorite blanket with the ducks on it. The time he built me a wooden stool so I could reach the sink. He wondered what I looked like now. If I had grown bitter. If I was stronger than he had ever been. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't offer any either. When I finished the last page, I sat still for a long time. I expected rage. I thought I'd feel betrayed all over again, but what I felt instead was sorrow. A deep, quiet sorrow that settled in my chest, like something that had always been there, waiting for a name. He had ruined so much. He had taken my mother's laughter. He had taken my childhood. But now, he was just a man who died alone in a gray cell, remembered only by the people he ran from. I didn't owe him anything, not tears, not absolution, but I could lay down the weight. That night, I packed the journal in a box, along with Mama's scarf and the note I'd saved for years. The one that had warned me he never made it out of the county. I lit a candle and set it by the window. Not as a welcome, but as a goodbye. I whispered one final truth to the empty room. I am not the child you left. I am the woman who survived. And for the first time, I believed it. I didn't tell anyone right away. Not the girls at work. Not Pastor Joe. Not even old Mrs. Hensley, who always knew everything before the rest of the town did. It wasn't shame. Not anymore. It was mine. This secret, this truth belonged to me and Mama now. Not to be spread like gossip or passed around the pews on Sunday morning. It was sacred, in a strange way. A final piece to a puzzle we had tried to solve in the dark. I thought about her more in those days than I had in years. How heavy it must have been, carrying the silence of a man who had walked out the door and never looked back. How hard it must have been to answer my questions, knowing she didn't have answers herself. Or, maybe she did, and she never told me. Maybe that note, "You should know he never made it past the county line," had come to her first. Maybe she had read it in the same way I had. Folded it quietly, tucked it into her Bible, and never said a word. I never felt angry with her for that, because when you love someone that deeply, sometimes the silence is the only thing you have left to protect them with. A week later, I returned to the cemetery. It had been a while. I always found some excuse: work, the weather, tired feet. But the truth was, I hadn't been ready. I brought fresh magnolias. Mama had loved those. Said they smelled like heaven if heaven wore perfume. I knelt by her stone and brushed away the fallen leaves. The wind rustled through the sycamore tree, just as it always had. I know now, I said softly. And I think maybe you did too. I didn't cry. I didn't whisper forgiveness or ask for signs. I just sat with her, let the sun warm my shoulders and the ground steady my knees. It felt like she was with me, not in some dramatic, ghostly way. Just in the quiet knowing that she always had been. When I stood to leave, I placed the magnolias gently against the stone and smiled. You were stronger than anyone ever gave you credit for. Then I walked home. That evening, I opened the journal one last time, not to read it again, but to write something in the back. Just one sentence. I survived. And I kept the light on, even when no one came home. I closed it, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it beneath Mama's Bible. Not hidden, not buried. Just placed. Where it belonged. In the days that followed, I felt something loosen inside me. Like a knot that had been there for so long, I'd forgotten it could come undone. I went to work. I baked a pie for Mrs. Hensley. I even accepted a ride home from a kind man who worked down the hall. A simple thing. Maybe, but it felt like the start of something new. The past hadn't disappeared. It never does. But it had changed shape. It no longer defined me. It no longer whispered at me from the corners of my silence. I had seen it, faced it, and let it be part of my story, instead of the whole of it. And that, my sweethearts, was enough. For weeks after I read the journal, I moved through my days like I was wearing someone else's shoes. They fit just well enough to get by, but they never felt quite right. The woman I had become, steady, quiet, reliable, didn't know what to do with this new truth. Not just about him, but about myself. I had spent so many years surviving, building, and holding it all together. Then this journal appeared and reminded me of what had been broken, what had been hidden, and what had been stolen from both me and Mama. I thought I had made peace with the past. I believed I had accepted what I would never know. But now I did know. I had the pages to prove it. His own handwriting, line after line, explaining the silence I carried for decades. He had been in prison, not lost, not dead, just locked away, hiding behind a false name and the belief that disappearing would hurt us less than the truth. I could not stop thinking about that, about how he had chosen absence over honesty. One Saturday morning, I put on my coat and walked to the courthouse archives. I had passed that building so many times over the years, but never stepped inside. I suppose I never had a reason until now. The receptionist, a young man named Caleb, looked up as I entered. He was polite and curious in the way people often are when they see someone older walking in with purpose. Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you today? I'm looking for case records, I said. An inmate from the 80s. He used a false name, but his real one was Raymond Elijah Carter. He paused. I saw him glance at the computer, then back at me. I can check. Would you be okay waiting a few minutes? I nodded. He disappeared through a side door, and I sat in a hard wooden chair that reminded me of Mama's kitchen set. I folded my hands in my lap and tried to steady my breathing. 15 minutes later, he returned with a stack of papers. These are copies of what we have on file: arrest report, intake forms, sentencing documents, some transcripts too. I took the bundle from him and walked to the reading table. I did not speak. My hands shook as I flipped to the first page. There he was. His mugshot stared back at me. He looked tired, not angry, just tired, like someone who had stopped trying to be anyone at all. He had been arrested under the name Jesse Mark Ellison. Charges included theft, possession of false documents, resisting arrest. Later there were mentions of attempted escape, solitary confinement, and poor behavior reviews. One document caught my eye. It was a transcript from his first intake interview. The officer had asked him, "Why the alias?" His response was simple: "No one's looking for me. It's better this way." I read that line again and again. He had believed we'd stopped searching. He had believed we were better off without him, and that belief had kept him hidden while Mama spent her life trying to keep me fed and clothed, while I grew up wondering what I had done wrong to make a father vanish. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I sat in silence until the words on the pages blurred into each other. He had erased himself from our lives. Not because he was forced to, because he thought we weren't worth the truth. When I got home, I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table where Mama and I used to share stories. I placed the court records beside the journal. Both of them were real. Both told the same story in different ways. One written by a man who wanted to be forgotten. One delivered by a system that kept secrets in folders and ink. I stared at them and asked the question I had avoided. Was it better that I knew, or had I reopened a wound that had already scarred? For the first time since I was a girl, I wrote a letter. Not to him, not to the prison, to myself. I wrote everything I felt. The betrayal, the grief, the ache of unanswered questions. I wrote that I forgave Mama for never telling me more. I wrote that I forgave myself for holding on to hope for so long. And then, at the very end, I wrote a single line. I am not unfinished. That was the truth I chose to keep. He had left us, but we had not disappeared. We had lived, we had endured, and we had become whole, even without his presence. I folded the letter and placed it inside the journal. Then I closed it and wrapped it in the same cloth I had used before. I didn't return it to the box this time. I laid it flat on my shelf, beside Mama's Bible and a framed picture of us from the church picnic in 1981. I wanted it close, not to dwell on, but to remind myself that closure doesn't always come from others. Sometimes, we give it to ourselves. A week later, I sat with Pastor Joe after service. I didn't plan to share anything. I just wanted to sit in the quiet of the empty pews, but he noticed something in my face. A stillness, maybe. Or the way my hands stayed folded in my lap. Are you all right? He asked gently. I looked at him and said, I found out where he went. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. He knew. What did you find? He said. I paused. Not what I hoped for, I answered, but what I needed. He nodded and didn't press further. Instead, he placed his hand over mine. You don't owe anyone the full story, just the piece you carry from it. That afternoon, I went home and cleaned the front porch. I trimmed the hedges and swept the leaves. It was nothing extraordinary, but it felt like living. That night, as the sun dipped low and the cicadas hummed their evening song, I wrote one more note, a short one. You broke us, but we healed without you. I did not sign it. I walked to the edge of the yard and burned it slowly in Mama's old tin pail. The ashes floated up into the sky, gray against orange, silent and free. I watched until they disappeared completely, and when I turned back toward the house, I did not carry any of it with me. That night I slept more deeply than I had in years. No dreams, no voices calling from the past, just the quiet breath of the wind moving through the curtains and the comfort of knowing that nothing else had to be uncovered. For a long time, I had lived as if part of me was still waiting, not for him, exactly, but for something to make sense, for the questions to be answered, for the silence to break. And now that it had, I no longer needed to hold my breath. I didn't tell anyone else about the journal or the court records, not because I was hiding them, but because the story was finished. It had taken decades to find the last chapter, but it was mine now. I didn't need to hand it to anyone else for validation. There is a kind of power in that. People often talk about closure like it's something another person can give you. A conversation, an apology, a final explanation. But I learned that closure is often what you do after the door stays shut. You sweep your own porch, you sit with your own heart, you write your own ending. One Sunday, I returned to Mama's grave. The magnolias I had brought weeks earlier were browning at the edges. I replaced them with fresh ones, white, full, fragrant. I knelt and pressed my palm to the earth. I know what happened now, I whispered, and I'm still standing. The wind moved through the trees above me like it always did, steady, familiar. I smiled. You were right to carry the silence, I said, but I was right to break it. I stayed there for a long while, listening to the birds and the rustle of branches, and then I stood and walked away, not heavy with grief but light with understanding. The past had not disappeared, but it had been named, and in that naming, I found freedom, not the kind that makes the pain vanish, but the kind that lets you live beside it without shrinking. That evening, I opened the windows in my home and let the fresh air move through every room. I dusted the frames. I played an old record Mama used to love. I poured myself a glass of lemonade and sat on the front steps as the sky turned a soft purple. It was not a grand moment, No one else would have noticed anything different about me, but I did. I was no longer the woman still waiting for something to come. I was the woman who had seen the truth, faced it, and walked forward anyway. And that, my dear, is sometimes the bravest thing a person can do. In the days that followed, I found myself more still than usual, not lazy or tired, just thoughtful. There were no more pages to read, no files to review, no one to confront. The story had unraveled, and it was now mine to fold back up, not to forget, but to live with. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel broken either. I felt like a woman standing in the middle of a long, quiet room, deciding which door to open next. The first choice came one morning as I was folding laundry, simple cotton sheets, sun-dried and warm from the line. I moved with the rhythm I'd known all my life, until I paused at a drawer I hadn't opened in years. It was Mama's old box of letters. She had saved nearly everything: grocery lists, birthday cards, school announcements, and near the bottom, a folded slip of paper I hadn't seen in a long time. The note: "You should know, he never made it past the county line." For years, I believed it meant he had died, that something tragic had happened right after he left. I had built that story in my mind so fully, so clearly, that when the truth finally came, I wasn't sure what was real anymore. But what if the note was never meant to imply death? What if Mama had known? Had she received something else I hadn't seen? Had she kept it from me not out of cruelty, but protection? The thought shook something inside me. For all my anger toward him, for all my grief over what he'd done, I had never once questioned my own version of the story. I had turned silence into assumption, and assumption into belief. Had I blamed Mama unfairly all these years? Had I seen her as withholding when really, she was just shielding me? That was the twist I hadn't expected. Not that he had lied, but that I had too, quietly, inwardly, to myself. That morning, I stood at the edge of the bed, holding the letter in both hands. I didn't feel guilt exactly, but I felt humbled. It is easy, my dears, to cling to one version of the past. It makes things neater, simpler, villain and victim, right and wrong. But life doesn't hold itself in clean lines like that. It curls, it folds, it doubles back on itself in ways that only make sense when you're very old and very still. I placed the letter back in the box and closed it gently. I could not rewrite the past, but I could stop holding it like a shield. That afternoon, I sat on the porch with a pen and paper. No intention, no plan, just the need to put something down. What came out was not a letter to him. It was to Mama. "Thank you for protecting me in the only way you knew how," I wrote. "I see it now. I see you now, and I hope that wherever you are, you feel the peace I finally found." I didn't cry when I wrote it. I smiled. I folded the note and tucked it into the pages of her Bible, not as an offering, as an answer. Later that week, I found myself at the community center, where they were collecting donations for the local literacy program. A young woman was sorting through boxes. "Miss Carter," she said when she saw me, "would you like to help with reading circles again this year?" I hesitated. For a moment, I thought about saying no, about continuing my quiet life with my garden, my books, and my tea. But something in me whispered otherwise. "Yes," I said, "I'd like that very much, because that, my dear, was the moment I chose what to carry forward, not the journal, not the file, not the ache, but the part of me that still had something to give." The reading circle met every Tuesday afternoon in the old school library, the one with creaky floors and books that still smelled like dust and sunshine. I sat in a wooden chair, watching a dozen little faces follow along as we read stories about talking animals and brave girls who found their way home. Some days, they asked me questions about the past, about what the world used to look like, about what I believed. One little boy, no older than 7, raised his hand one afternoon and asked, "Did you ever get lost and find your way back?" I felt the question land deeper than he intended. "Yes," I said, "not on a map, but in my heart. And I did find my way." The room went quiet for a second. Then, another child asked if we could read the story again. That evening, as I walked home beneath a sky painted in soft pink and gold, I thought about what it meant to return, not to a person or a place, but to yourself. For so many years, I had waited for a letter, a call, a knock at the door, anything that might have said, "You mattered enough to explain," but I didn't need that anymore. I mattered because I had lived, because I had raised a child, because I had kept going, because I had found strength in places I never expected, because I had chosen not to let someone else's silence define my voice. That is the power you discover with age. The world doesn't always apologize. The people who hurt you may never return. The answers you needed may arrive far too late, but you still get to choose who you become. And I chose to become someone who forgave without forgetting, who loved without condition, who carried the past with dignity, not resentment. One quiet evening, I took the journal and the file and placed them both in a plain brown envelope. I sealed it and wrote a date across the front. No name, just the year Mama passed. I placed it in a drawer with my will and my final instructions. Not to burden anyone, but in case someone ever came looking for the story, it would be there, not to reopen old wounds, but to remind them that even when everything falls apart, there is still the chance to rise again. And that was enough. A few weeks later, I found myself back at the edge of the same field where I used to wait for the bus as a little girl. The road hadn't changed much, the same gravel, the same bend in the fence, a few more weeds, a few fewer trees, but the bones of it were the same. I stood there for a long while, breathing in the warm air and letting the sun rest on my shoulders. No one was waiting for me. No, one was coming up the road, but I was not waiting either. That was the difference. I had once stood here full of questions. I had once believed that if I stood still long enough, the past might turn around and explain itself, that someone might return and make everything right. But now, standing there as an old woman, I knew the truth. The people who leave rarely come back the way we hope they will. And sometimes, even if they do, the person we need most to return is not them. It is the version of ourselves we lost while waiting. I turned back toward home, walking slower than I used to, but lighter than I had in years. That night, as I sat by the window with my cup of tea, I wrote one final note in the margin of Mama's Bible. Just 5 words. The waiting did not break me. I smiled as I closed it, because it hadn't. It had shaped me, strengthened me, refined me into someone who knew her own worth, with or without an apology. And that, my dear, was the resolution I chose. Not to forget, not to pretend, but to remember, and still move forward, with grace, with peace. And with no more waiting. You know, my sweethearts, when I first began this story, I told you that it wasn't about healing the way people expect, that it wasn't a neat little tale with a perfect ending. And I meant that. Because life rarely wraps itself up in tidy bows. It doesn't care much for how we want the story to go. It simply moves forward, sideways, sometimes in circles, and we are left to follow, or sit still, and watch it pass. I spent so many years waiting for a call that never came. Birthdays, graduations, weddings, days, when I held the phone just a little longer in my hand, pretending I needed to check the time, or the weather, or anything at all, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the silence would break. But it never did. And for a long time, that silence felt like a verdict, like proof that I wasn't enough, that I had been forgotten. What I didn't realize back then was that the call one was waiting for wasn't just from him, it was from myself, from the part of me that needed to say, you don't need answers to move on, you don't need permission to grow, you are not waiting anymore, you are living. And once I heard that voice, my own, not his, I began to heal. It was not dramatic, there was no moment of fireworks, no grand speech or final knock at the door, just small things, quiet mornings, clean laundry, teaching a child to read, hearing birdsong through an open window and realizing it brought joy again. Those are the signs, my dears, that you've made peace. Not the absence of pain, but the return of presence. Now, when I look back, I do not wish for a different ending. I wish only that I had known sooner how strong I already was. I wish I had seen that sometimes, the people who vanish leave room for us to grow into someone braver than we ever thought we could be. So if you are listening now, if you are holding on to a silence, a sorrow, a story that still aches, I want you to know this. You are not forgotten. You are not broken. You are still becoming, and there is no shame in the waiting. As long as you don't let it keep you from living, let your days be full of purpose. Even when the past lingers in the background like a familiar shadow, let your voice be steady, even when others choose silence. And most of all, let your story be yours, not because it was perfect, but because you had the courage to tell it. Thank you, my sweethearts, for walking this long road with me, for listening with your hearts and sitting beside me in the quiet. Now, Before we part ways, I'll ask just one small thing. If you listened to the whole story, my sweethearts, thank you. Tell me in the comments what you would have done, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to live on, because the past may echo, but it is our voices today that carry it forward, and that, my dears, is something truly beautiful.